You think homesteaders in the 1970s were eating TV dinners and instant mashed potatoes? Not a chance. While suburban America was discovering microwave ovens and frozen food aisles, rural homesteaders were still cooking recipes their grandparents survived the Depression on. These weren't nostalgic experiments or hobby cooking. These were real meals that fed real families across remote farms and mountain hollows during a decade when plenty of Americans still lived close to the land. Let's dig into 25 homestead recipes from the 1970s that have completely vanished from modern kitchens. Potato pancakes. Before hash browns became the default diner breakfast, 1970s homesteaders made potato pancakes when the root-cellar held nothing but potatoes and the grocery run was still 3 days away. This was German and Eastern European cooking that had filtered through generations, landing in farmhouses across Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and anywhere immigrants had settled. You'd pull out 5 or 6 large potatoes from storage, peel them, and grate them by hand using a box grater. Your knuckles would get scraped, your hands would turn black from the starch. But you'd keep going until you had a big bowl of shredded potatoes. Then you'd squeeze out as much liquid as possible, wringing the grated potatoes in a clean dish towel until your hands ached. Mix in a couple eggs, maybe a quarter cup of flour, some diced onion if you had it, and season with salt and pepper. The batter should hold together, but stay loose. Heat your cast iron skillet until it was smoking hot. Add a good amount of bacon drippings or vegetable oil, and drop in mounds of potato mixture, pressing them flat with your spatula. Each pancake took about 4 minutes per side, the edges getting dark and lacy crisp, while the center stayed creamy. You'd flip them carefully because they wouldn't fall apart. When both sides were golden brown with crispy bits, you drain them on newspaper and serve them immediately. These weren't a side dish. For many homestead families, 6 potato pancakes with a little sour cream or applesauce on top was dinner. One 10-pound sack of potatoes could feed a family for a week this way. Hoover Stew, named bitterly after President Herbert Hoover during the Depression, this stew was still being made in poor rural households through the 1970s when money ran out before the month did. The name itself was an insult. A way of saying this is what we're reduced to eating. The base was simple and heartbreaking. Elbow macaroni, the cheapest pasta you could buy, a can of tomatoes, or if you were really broke, ketchup thin with water. Hot dogs if you had a couple dollars, usually the cheapest fatty ones in the store, the kind that were more filler than meat. You boil your macaroni in salted water, drain it, then dump it back in the pot with your tomatoes and sliced hot dogs. Everything cooked together for 20 minutes on low heat. The macaroni soaking up the tomato liquid and swelling to maximum size. The hot dogs would release their fat, creating an oily sheen on top that at least made the dish feel more substantial than it was. The smell was tomato, meat grease, and poverty all mixed together. The taste was exactly what you'd expect, filling but not satisfying, cheap in every sense of the word. Kids who grew up eating Hoover Stew during lean times often refused to make it as adults, even when their own families hit hard times. The memory was too bitter, too tied to hunger and shame. But in the 1970s, when inflation hit hard and jobs dried up in rural areas, plenty of families found themselves making Hoover Stew again and hating every bite. Scrapple. Pennsylvania Dutch country held on to Scrapple through the 1970s, and homesteaders who butchered their own pigs knew this was the ultimate expression of using every part of the animal. After you'd rendered the lard, cured the hams, and made sausages, you still had scraps left over. Organ meats, head meat, bits of fat and skin, even tongue and heart, parts that were perfectly edible but not pretty enough for anything else. All of this went into a huge pot with onions, sage, black pepper, and salt, then boil for hours until meat fell off any bones and the broth turned thick and gelatinous from dissolved collagen. You'd strain everything out, pick through carefully to remove bones, and chop the meat almost to the paste. Some people ran it through a grinder. The broth went back on the stove, and you'd bring it to a boil before slowly stirring in cornmeal, cooking and stirring constantly for up to an hour. Your arm would ache from the stirring, but you couldn't stop or the thick mixture would scorch. When the cornmeal was cooked through, thick as porridge, you mix the chopped meat back in and pour everything into loaf pans greased with lard. Overnight, the scrapple would solidify into a firm loaf you could slice. Next morning, you cut it thick and fry it in lard until it developed a dark, Crispy crust outside, while staying creamy inside, served with eggs and fried potatoes. Scrapple was breakfast that represented not wasting a single edible scrap from butchering day. The flavor was porky and rich with the cornmeal providing substance, and the spices cutting through the richness. Egg drop soup. When a laying hen stopped producing, she became soup, and homesteaders in the 1970s knew how to stretch that old bird into multiple meals. After butchering and cleaning her, you'd simmer the entire carcass for 6 or 7 hours until the bones went soft and the broth turned golden and rich with fat floating on top. That precious stock sat in a pot on the back of the stove, simmering constantly, getting used bit by bit through the week. When you needed a quick meal, you'd ladle some into a saucepan, bring it to a rolling boil, and season it with whatever you had. Salt always, maybe some dried sage or thyme hanging from the rafters, a little pepper. Then came the magic part. You'd crack an egg into a bowl, beat it lightly with a fork, and drizzle it slowly into the swirling, boiling stock while stirring constantly with your other hand. The egg would form these delicate ribbons and clouds, transforming thin broth into something that looked and felt more substantial. Some people added a spoonful of cornstarch mixed with cold water, first to make the soup cling to the spoon better. The whole process took maybe 10 minutes from cold stock to finished soup, but it felt like alchemy. 2 ingredients, stock and egg, becoming a meal that warmed you from the inside out and settled in your stomach with surprising staying power. This was sick days soup, quick dinner soup, and nothing left in the house soup all in one. Salt pork with milk gravy. Through the 1970s, rural families who still butchered their own hogs in late fall kept salt pork in barrels down in the root-cellar. Thick slabs preserved in massive amount of salt that would keep all winter without refrigeration. This was survival meat from an earlier era that plenty of homesteaders still relied on. The salt pork was almost inedible straight from the barrel. So salty it would make your mouth pucker. You'd slice off what you needed and soak it in fresh water for an hour, changing the water twice to pull out enough salt that the meat became palatable. Then you cut it into quarter-inch slices and fry them slowly in your cast iron skillet until fat rendered out and the edges got crispy while the center stayed slightly chewy. The real magic happened after you removed the pork. All that rendered fat stayed in the skillet, and you'd sprinkle flour directly into it, stirring constantly with a wooden spoon to make a roux. You had to watch it carefully, letting it turn golden and smell nutty without burning. Then you'd slowly pour in fresh milk, whisking the whole time to prevent lumps. The gravy would thicken up, becoming pale and creamy with little brown speckles from a roux and bits of crispy pork stuck to the bottom of the pan. This gravy went over everything: biscuits, boiled potatoes, toast, cornbread. 1 pound of salt pork could flavor enough gravy to feed a family of 6 for dinner, stretching expensive meat into something that filled everyone's plates. Beans and hot water cornbread. This Depression-era combination kept Appalachian families alive through the 1970s when money disappeared and the garden hadn't come in yet. The brutal simplicity of it tells you everything about how some people were still living in rural America 50 years ago. You'd cook a pot of pinto beans with whatever pork you had. Maybe a ham hock if you'd save one. Maybe just a bone from a ham you'd already eaten. Maybe nothing but the beans themselves if times were really hard. Salt, pepper, and hours of slow cooking until the beans broke down slightly and created their own thick pot liquor. The hot water cornbread was even more stripped down than regular cornbread. No eggs, no milk, no baking powder, nothing but cornmeal, boiling water, and salt. You'd pour boiling water over your cornmeal in a bowl, stirring until it formed a thick, moldable dough that was almost too hot to handle. Then you'd shape it with your hands into flat patties and fry them in a skillet with just enough grease to keep them from sticking. The result was crispy outside, dense and slightly gummy inside, not light or fluffy like real cornbread, but filling a way that stuck to your ribs. You'd break up the hot water cornbread directly into your bowl of beans, letting it soak up all that pot liquor. This meal cost almost nothing and could feed a family for days. It wasn't good exactly, but it was food, and sometimes that was enough. Mulligan Stew, born in hobo camps during the Depression, but still made by struggling homesteaders in the 1970s. Mulligan Stew was democracy in a pot. The concept was beautiful in its simplicity. Everyone contributed what they had. And together you created something that fed everyone. When times got hard and neighbors knew other families were struggling, someone would start a pot of Mulligan Stew. One family brought potatoes. Another had carrots they could spare. Someone else contributed an onion or a can of tomatoes they'd put up last summer. If anyone had meat, even just a small piece of salt pork or some bones, that went in too. Everything simmered together in a massive pot, usually over an outdoor fire, for hours. The vegetables would cook down until soft. Any meat would fall apart, and the broth would become rich with all those combined flavors. You'd season it with salt, pepper, and whatever else people brought. Maybe some herbs from someone's garden. Maybe hot sauce if someone had it. The stew had no fixed recipe because it couldn't. It was whatever people had that particular day. But that was the point. Individually, these families had almost nothing. Together, they created something substantial that fed everyone. Mulligan Stew represented survival through community. The idea that pooling resources meant nobody had to go hungry, even when times were brutal. This kind of communal cooking happened more than people realized in 1970s rural areas, where poverty was still grinding, and neighbors looked out for each other. Slumgullion. The name sounds like an insult, and honestly, Slumgullion was a homestead version of desperation cooking. This was what you made when you were cleaning out everything that hadn't spoiled yet and needed to create something edible from mismatched ingredients. You'd take whatever leftover meat you had, maybe some dried beef or salt pork, chop it fine, and brown it in a pot with onions if you had them. Then came whatever vegetables were available: potatoes, canned tomatoes, corn, beans, cabbage. Nothing matched, nothing coordinated. You'd add water or thin broth if you had it, season with salt and pepper, and let everything simmer until soft. The result was a thick, slightly murky stew that never looked appetizing but filled stomachs when that was a main requirement. Some versions got thickened with leftover bread or crackers crushed and stirred in at the end. The flavor was unpredictable because the ingredients changed every time you made it. Slumgullion represented honest poverty without pretense. Nobody claimed this was good food or tried to dress it up with fancy names. It was fuel, pure and simple, made when you were too tired or too poor to care about flavor or appearance. You ate it because you needed calories for the next day's work, and Slumgullion provided that cheaply and efficiently. This was survival cooking stripped down to its most basic function: Depression-era potato soup. When the economy tanked in the mid-1970s and inflation hit rural families hard, potato soup made a comeback because potatoes were cheap, filling, and stored well through winter. But this wasn't loaded potato soup with bacon and cheese and sour cream. This was the stripped-down survival version that Depression survivors had taught their children. You dice potatoes and boil them in water with onions if you could spare them, cooking until potatoes were soft enough to mash partially with a fork right in the pot. This created a naturally thick, starchy base without needing cream or flour. If you had a cup of milk, you'd add it, creating a pale, creamy soup. If you didn't, you made it with just water, relying entirely on potato starch for body, salt and pepper for seasoning, maybe a tiny bit of butter or bacon grease if you had it. That was a soup. Plain, filling, cheap. You could make a gallon for less than 50 cents. Families ate it 3 or 4 times a week during bad months, served with whatever bread they could make or afford. It wasn't delicious. It wasn't exciting, but it kept bodies functioning and provided enough calories to work. Children who grew up eating this kind of potato soup remembered it their whole lives, not fondly, but as a marker of hard times. The taste of plain potato soup meant money was tight and things were difficult, but it also meant you weren't going hungry, which counted for something. Hasty Pudding. Before instant oatmeal existed, Hasty Pudding was the original quick breakfast that 1970s homesteaders still made when they needed something hot and filling fast. The name tells the whole story. This was food made in a hurry when you had a full day of work ahead and needed fuel immediately. You bring water or milk to a rolling boil, then slowly pour in cornmeal while stirring constantly to prevent lumps from forming. The mixture would thicken as it cooked, becoming a porridge that could be as thin or thick as you wanted depending on how much cornmeal you added. The cooking took maybe 15 minutes of constant stirring over fire or stove. Some homesteaders added molasses if they had it, creating what was called Indian pudding, a sweeter version that felt more like dessert than breakfast. Others kept it plain, seasoning only with salt and adding a pat of butter if they could spare it. You'd serve it steaming hot in bowls, and it would stick to your ribs for hours of hard physical labor. The interesting part was what happened to leftovers. Hasty pudding would solidify overnight as it cooled, and next morning you could slice the cold, firm pudding and fry it in lard until both sides were crispy. Serve that with syrup or gravy, and you had a completely different meal from the same batch. This was efficient cooking, making one pot of porridge stretch into multiple meals with different textures and flavors. Traditional boiled dinner. New England homesteaders kept the tradition of boiled dinner alive through the 1970s, making this one-pot meal every Sunday in farmhouses from Massachusetts to Maine. This was practical cooking, one pot, one fire, minimal attention required while you worked. You'd start with a large piece of corned beef or salt pork, placing it in your biggest pot with water to cover. This simmered for hours, 3 or 4 at least, until the meat was tender and the house filled with a salty, meaty aroma. After the meat had cooked sufficiently, you'd add vegetables in stages based on their cooking times. Potatoes and turnips went in first because they took longest, then cabbage and carrots. Finally, beets, but those were kept separate so they wouldn't turn everything pink. Everything cooked in the same flavorful, salty broth from the meat. The timing required skill and attention. You wanted everything done simultaneously. Vegetables tender but not mushy, meat fully cooked but not falling apart. When finished, you'd arrange it all on a large platter. Sliced meat surrounded by the vegetables, each one having absorbed the meat's flavor during cooking. A little vinegar or mustard on the side cut through the saltiness. This was efficiency cooking at its finest. Minimal fuel use, minimal pot washing, maximum nutrition delivered to the table. Fried salt pork and greens. Before anyone romanticized Southern cooking, Appalachian homesteaders ate fried salt pork and greens because it was what kept through winter and what grew reliably in the garden. This wasn't cuisine. This was sustenance. You'd take thick slabs of salt pork from a barrel and slice them, then fry them slowly in a cast iron skillet until fat rendered out and the meat turned crispy and dark around the edges. That rendered fat, precious and flavorful, stayed in the pan. Then you'd stuff the skillet full of greens, collards, turnip greens, mustard greens, whatever your garden had produced. The greens would wilt dramatically in the hot fat, reducing to maybe a quarter of their original volume. You'd add a little water or pot liquor, cover the skillet, and let everything braise for 20 minutes until the greens were tender and had absorbed all that porky fat. The result was a tangle of dark green leaves, silky with fat, slightly bitter from the greens themselves, punctuated with crispy pieces of salt pork. You'd serve this with cornbread to soak up the pot liquor left in the bottom of the skillet. This meal provided calories from the fat, vitamins from the greens, and satisfaction despite costing almost nothing. One slab of salt pork and a mess of greens could feed a family, stretching winter stores into actual meals. Red-eye gravy with country ham. Southern homesteaders created red-eye gravy through necessity, using coffee to deglaze the pan after frying ham. This wasn't French cooking technique. This was making gravy from literal pan drippings and yesterday's leftover coffee, because those were the only two liquids available. You'd fry thick slices of country ham, salt-cured and aged, in a cast-iron skillet until the edges crisped and the ham released its fat. The ham would leave behind brown, caramelized bits stuck to pan. Instead of using milk or cream like normal gravy, you'd pour strong black coffee into that hot skillet. The coffee would bubble furiously, dissolving all those flavorful brown bits while mixing with the ham fat to create a thin, dark gravy with reddish tint in certain light. Hence the name Red Eye. The flavor was unlike any other gravy, slightly bitter from the coffee, salty from the ham, with a sharp, complex taste that woke up your palate. You'd serve it over biscuits or grits with the fried ham alongside. The coffee's bitterness cut to the ham, salt, and fat perfectly, creating a balanced breakfast that fueled hard physical labor. This was resourceful cooking, using leftover coffee and pan drippings to create something memorable instead of washing both down the drain. Red-eye gravy was Depression-era ingenuity still being practiced in 1970s rural kitchens. Cream chip beef on toast. Military mess halls called it S.O.S. And yes, definitely didn't stand for save, But homesteaders have been making this dish long before World War II soldiers complained about it. Chipped beef was dried beef sliced paper thin and packed in jars, shelf-stable for months without refrigeration, which made it perfect for remote homesteads. You'd reconstitute the salty, leathery beef in hot water to remove some of the intense saltiness, then drain it thoroughly. In a saucepan, you make white sauce, melt butter, whisk in flour to make a roux, then slowly add milk while stirring constantly until thick and creamy. The shredded beef went into this sauce, creating a salty, creamy mixture. This got poured over toasted bread, which would soak up the gravy on the bottom while staying crispy on top. The flavor was aggressively salty, creamy, and oddly comforting despite looking completely unappetizing. Grayish meat suspended in white sauce wasn't winning any beauty contests, but it delivered carbs, protein, and fat in equal measure. Homesteaders made this when fresh meat was unavailable, but you needed something more substantial than bread and butter. The jarred chipped beef kept indefinitely in the pantry, making it perfect for winter months or lean times when getting to town was difficult. It wasn't pretty, but it filled bellies and got families through hard times. Fried cornmeal mush. Before polenta became trendy in fancy restaurants, homesteaders made cornmeal mush, plain cornmeal cooked in water until thick, then transformed leftovers into fried mush, which was arguably better than the original meal. You cook cornmeal in boiling salted water, stirring constantly until it became thick as porridge. Serve some for dinner, then pour the rest into a loaf pan and refrigerate overnight. The mush would solidify into a firm loaf you could slice like bread. Next morning, you cut thick slices and fry them in bacon fat or lard until crusty and golden on both sides. The exterior would crisp up beautifully, while the interior stayed creamy and soft. The texture contrast was everything, that crunchy crust giving way to smooth cornmeal inside. Some homesteaders served this with syrup or molasses for breakfast, making it sweet. Others served it with gravy or alongside eggs, treating it as a starch. Fried mush represented pure economy. Make a big batch of cornmeal porridge for one dinner, then create a completely different meal from the leftovers. No waste. 2 distinct meals from one cooking, minimal ingredients. This was the kind of practical cooking that kept grocery bills low and families fed through tight times. Johnny Cakes. Rhode Island claimed Johnny Cakes as their specialty, but homesteaders across America made versions of these simple cornmeal flat cakes. The original recipe was almost insultingly simple: cornmeal, boiling water, and salt. That's it. Some added a little milk if they had it. But traditional Johnny Cakes needed only those 3 ingredients. You'd pour boiling water over cornmeal and salt, stirring until you had a thick batter. Not quite pancake consistency, but not dough either. Then you drop spoonfuls onto a hot, greased griddle, flattening them slightly with your spoon. They'd cook until crusty and brown on the bottom. Then you flip them and cook the other side. The finished Johnny Cakes were crispy outside with a slightly gummy interior and pronounced corn flavor. Homesteaders ate them with butter and syrup for breakfast or alongside beans and pork for dinner. They were portable food too. You could wrap them in cloth and take them to the fields, eating them cold with your hands during brief breaks from work. Different regions developed variations. Some made them thin and lacy, others thick and cake-like, but all versions represented the same principle: maximum calories from minimal ingredients. Johnny Cakes were emergency food, everyday food, and traveling food all in one. Corn pone and drippings. Southern homesteaders survived on corn pone and drippings when literally nothing else existed in the house. Corn pone was even simpler than cornbread, just cornmeal, water, and salt mixed into a thick dough shaped into oval patties, and either baked on a flat rock next to the fire or fried in a skillet. The result was dense and dry, so dry you couldn't swallow it easily without liquid. That's where the drippings came in. Every homestead kept a jar or can of drippings, the fat rendered from any meat you'd cooked. Bacon, salt pork, fried chicken. Anything that produced grease got saved in that jar. You crumble your corn pone into a bowl and pour hot drippings over it, letting the fat soak into the dense cornmeal. The combination was pure calories: carbohydrates from the corn, fat from the drippings, salt for flavor. It tasted like survival, greasy and heavy, but completely satisfying in a primal way. This meal cost almost nothing and provided enough energy for a full day of field work. No vegetables, no protein beyond the fat, just fuel for the human machine. People who grew up eating corn pone and drippings during lean times rarely made it voluntarily as adults, but they never forgot how to make it either. It was emergency food, backup plan cooking, something you knew how to do if everything else failed. Salt belly and beans. Before anyone romanticized cowboy cooking, ranch hands and homesteaders lived on salt belly and beans because it was cheap, portable, and wouldn't spoil without refrigeration. Salt belly was salt-cured pork belly, similar to bacon but fattier and saltier, preserved specifically for long-term storage. You'd slice it thick and fry it in your skillet or Dutch oven until the fat rendered out and the meat crisped slightly. Then you'd add dried beans, usually pintos, that you'd soaked overnight, pour in water, and let everything simmer for hours over a low fire. The beans would absorb the pork fat, turning creamy and rich, while the salt belly softened and flavored everything. The result was a pot of beans swimming in porky liquid, studded with chunks of fatty meat. You'd eat this straight from the pot, scooping it into tin plates or bowls, sopping it up with cornbread or biscuits. The flavor was intensely salty, fatty, and satisfying in a primitive way that appealed to bodies doing hard physical work. This meal required minimal preparation, basically cooked itself, and provided tremendous calories for physical labor. Cowboys ate this on trail drives through the 1970s in some places. Homesteaders ate it during planting and harvest when there was no time for elaborate cooking. It was fuel, plain and simple, that kept working bodies functioning. Split pea soup with ham bones. After serving a ham for Sunday dinner, 1970s homesteaders took that bone with its clinging bits of meat and fat and turned it into split pea soup that fed the family for 3 more days. This was resourcefulness elevated to art form, making something from what others might throw away. That ham bone went into your largest pot with dried split peas, an onion, carrots if you had them, and enough water to cover everything by several inches. The pot would sit on the back of the stove simmering for hours, 4 or 5, sometimes 6 hours, until the peas had completely broken down into a thick puree and every bit of flavor had leached from the bone. The house would fill with a smoky, savory smell that made your mouth water, even though you knew you were eating last Sunday's leftovers. Eventually, you'd fish out the bone, pick off any remaining bits of meat, chop them fine, and stir them back into the soup. The soup itself was thick as porridge by this point, greenish gold in color, with a rich ham flavor that tasted like comfort food despite being made from scraps. You'd serve it with cornbread or biscuits for soaking up the thick soup. This was complete nutrition. Protein from the ham, fiber and more protein from the peas, vegetables from the carrots and onion. One ham bone could make enough soup to feed a family of 6 for multiple meals, which is why homesteaders never threw bones away. Every part of every ingredient had value and purpose. Fish head stew. Coastal and river homesteaders made fish head stew from what commercial fishermen and fish markets threw away. The heads, tails, and bones that contained the most flavor but looked too ugly for retail customers. In fishing communities, this wasn't poverty food. It was smart cooking that used the best parts others wasted. You'd take several large fish heads, cod or salmon, or whatever was running locally, and simmer them for hours with onions, potatoes, salt pork, and water. The fish heads contained gelatinous flesh in the cheeks, rich fat behind the eyes, and tremendous flavor in the bones. As everything simmered, the heads would break down, the cheek meat falling off, and the broth becoming thick and milky with fish oils and collagen. You'd pick through the stew, removing larger bones, but the small ones dissolved completely during the long cooking. The final product was cloudy white, incredibly rich, with chunks of potato and bits of fish meat throughout. Some families thickened it further with flour or cornmeal, creating a chowder-like consistency. The flavor was intensely fishy. You either loved it or hated it with no middle ground. But for fishing families in the 1970s, this stew represented free protein and calories made from parts that commercial operations discarded. When you lived near water and knew how to cook, nothing went to waste. Tripe Stew. Homesteaders who butchered their own cattle in the 1970s didn't waste the stomach lining. They made tripe stew, which required patience, strong stomach, and half a day's cooking. Tripe is cow's stomach, and it needs extensive preparation to become edible. You'd scrub it thoroughly under cold running water, blanch it in boiling water, scrub it again, then cut it into strips. The cooking process was marathon length. You'd simmer those strips for 4 to 6 hours with onions, garlic, tomatoes, and whatever vegetables you had available. The tripe would gradually transform from rubbery and tough to tender and almost gelatinous, developing a unique, slightly spongy texture that was impossible to describe if you'd never eaten it. The flavor was remarkably mild, almost neutral, taking on whatever seasonings you used. Some homesteaders made it with milk, creating a white, creamy stew. Others used tomatoes, making it red and tangy. The key was never rushing it. Try to eat tripe before it's fully cooked and it stays rubber, but cook it properly for the full time, and it became rich and satisfying, representing using every part of the animal. Many people couldn't get past the texture or the knowledge of what they were eating, but practical homesteaders saw only protein and calories that would otherwise go to waste. In lean times, you couldn't afford to be squeamish. Stone-boiled beef. By the 1970s, stone boiling was mostly a historical curiosity, but a few old-timers in remote areas still knew the technique and occasionally demonstrated it, keeping alive a cooking method that dated back thousands of years. This was how people cooked before metal pots existed. You'd dig a pit and line it with animal hide. For side out, creating a watertight container. Fill it with water and chunks of meat. Then came the ingenious part. Heat stones at a fire until they were scorching hot and carefully transfer them into the water using wooden tongs or green branches. The hot stones would make the water boil violently. As they cooled, you'd replace them with more hot stones in the fire, keeping the water boiling for hours. The process required constant attention and a hot fire to keep heating stones, but it produced surprisingly tender meat cooked in its own juices with whatever wild onions or roots you'd added. The meat would eventually fall apart tender, the broth rich and fatty. Some homesteaders in very remote areas without proper cookware still use this method in the early 1970s, particularly during hunting trips or when setting up new homesteads. It represented pure ingenuity, cooking without manufactured tools, using only what nature provided and human cleverness. Burgoo, Kentucky's answer to feeding massive crowds. Burgoo was still being made at 1970s homestead gatherings and community events. This was epic cooking that required a full day's work and whatever meat you could hunt, trap, or butcher. Traditional burgoo started with wild game, squirrel, rabbit, whatever you'd shot or trapped. By the 1970s, most people used chicken, mutton, or pork, but the old-timers still insisted squirrel made the best burgoo. You need a massive cast iron kettle set up over an outdoor fire, big enough to hold gallons of stew. The meat got browned first in batches to develop flavor. Then came the vegetables. Corn cut fresh from the cob, lima beans, tomatoes, potatoes, onions, cabbage, pounds and pounds of each. Everything went into that kettle with water and seasonings. Then someone had to stand there stirring constantly with a long wooden paddle to keep it from scorching on the bottom. 6 to 8 hours later, you have burger thick enough to eat with a fork. The vegetables had broken down partially. The meat had fallen apart into shreds, and the whole thing had cooked down into a thick, rich stew that fed 100 people easily. The flavor was complex, all those ingredients melding together over hours of cooking. This was celebration food, community food, made when people gathered for harvest festivals or church picnics. One kettle of burger meant everyone ate well, regardless of what they could afford. Brunswick Stew. Virginia and North Carolina both claimed Brunswick Stew as theirs, but homesteaders across the South made versions of the thick, tomato-based stew through the 1970s using whatever small game they'd hunted. Traditional versions called for squirrel, which might sound strange now but was common protein in rural areas where squirrels were abundant and free. You'd clean and butcher the squirrels, then simmer them for hours until the meat fell off the bones. Some people used rabbit instead, or chicken once that became easier to get than wild game. After the meat was tender, you'd pick it off the bones, shred it, and add it back to the pot along with corn, lima beans, tomatoes, potatoes, and onions. Everything cooked together for several more hours, low and slow, until it reached a consistency somewhere between soup and hash. The vegetables would break down partially, while still maintaining some texture. You'd season it heavily with black pepper, and maybe a touch of cayenne, if you could handle heat. The corn would burst and help thicken the liquid. The potatoes would dissolve slightly at their edges. The finished stew was thick, rich, and satisfying, with all those flavors melded together after hours of cooking. Brunswick Stew was fall and winter cooking, made when the harvest came in and hunting season opened. You'd serve it in deep bowls with cornbread for sopping up the thick liquid. This was complete meal cooking, protein and vegetables together, feeding families efficiently. Mock apple pie. During the Depression, when apples were unaffordable luxuries, homemakers created mock apple pie from Ritz crackers, sugar, and lemon juice. And somehow it tasted like apple pie despite containing 0 apples. The recipe became famous through Ritz cracker boxes. But by the 1970s, struggling homesteaders were rediscovering it as inflation made real fruit expensive. You'd make a standard pie crust, then create the filling by layering crushed crackers with syrup made from sugar, water, cream of tartar, and lemon juice or vinegar for tanginess. As it baked, the crackers would absorb the syrup and soften, creating a texture remarkably similar to cooked apples. The lemon provided fruity tartness. The sugar provided sweetness. And somehow your brain convinced itself this was apple pie, at least close enough. It wasn't perfect. The texture was slightly softer, the flavor not quite right. But when you hadn't tasted real apple pie in months, mock apple pie was miraculous. It represented Depression-era ingenuity that came roaring back during 1970s economic troubles, creating the illusion of abundance from basically nothing. The psychological comfort of eating pie during hard times mattered almost as much as the calories. This dessert was hope masquerading as pastry. Proof that you could still have something sweet even when money was desperately tight. So there you have it. 25 homestead recipes from the 1970s that have completely faded from American kitchens. Which one surprised you most? Would you actually try any of these? Or are they better left in the past where they belong? Drop a comment and let me know. And if you enjoyed this trip down memory lane, hit that subscribe button because we got plenty more forgotten recipes and rural history coming your way.